The town of Stratford upon Avon is known throughout the world as the birthplace of William Shakespeare. Every year people come here from across the globe on a pilgrimage to pay homage to this, the greatest literary genius of the English-speaking peoples. They come to see performances of his plays at the theatres of the Royal Shakespeare Company. And they also come to see something of the properties associated with the Shakespeare family. It's difficult to imagine that the River Avon was once a busy waterway, feeding the industrial towns of the Midlands. Today, Stratford's role as one of Warwickshire's oldest market towns is dwarfed by its tourist industry.
I'm going to show you where we are.
Throughout the town, there are constant reminders of Shakespeare, his family, and his plays. It really does live up to its reputation as Shakespeare's town. But Stratford's rich history began long before William Shakespeare was born.
I suppose Stratford's, if you like, more modern beginnings start with the Saxons. It was they who gave the name to the community. Stratford means simply the strat or street fording a river, and points to the town's origins as an important river crossing settlement. And in those very early years, the River Avon was fordable at most times of the year at where the bridge is today. Later there were wooden bridges, and then the very fine stone one came along in the late medieval period. It's interesting that Stratford features quite prominently in the Domesday Book, and certainly by the early 11th century it was a farming and a fishing community of considerable size.
Much of the old town's present layout was the result of deliberate town planning in 1196. The street pattern of the old part of the town has survived almost intact, and many of the streets still have their medieval names. Bridge Street, which leads into Wood Street and Greenhill Street, formed part of the old Roman road leading down to the ford, and was retained as a main thoroughfare.
The new town laid out by the Bishop of Worcester was very much related to his desire to create a more thriving trading and marketing community. And it's interesting that, in fact, before those new streets were laid out, the bishop had acquired a market charter in 1196, in fact, giving him the right to hold regular markets here. And it's quite clear that in the next 300 years or so, up until, say, Shakespeare's own time, Stratford did develop very, very successfully, I think, as a major exchange centre for this part of England. And the street names of the town today, in the heart, are mainly 13th century and point to the particular markets that were held there, so that one can walk through Rother Street now, which was the original cattle market. Rother is an old English word for cattle or for oxen. Visitors going down from the centre of town to the theatre today would normally walk down Sheep Street, obviously the centre of the sale for wool and sheep in medieval and in Shakespeare's time. And indeed, almost every street, or many of its streets at any rate, had a particular market that was held there.
Stratford was a meeting point where the Forest of Arden to the north encountered the open arable farmland south of the river. It was a focus of routes where the roads from the great towns of the West Midlands converged and met before running east and south. The River Avon had always played an important part in the fortunes of the town, and its importance as a waterway increased steadily. Since early times, crossing the river in periods of flood had proved difficult, even after the completion of the wooden bridge in the 13th century. At such times, some traders refused to go to Stratford because it was too dangerous. But the town's prosperity was secured with the creation of a thoroughfare which is still the main crossing into Stratford today. This splendid stone bridge, with its 14 arches, was built at the end of the 15th century by Hugh Clopton. Before Shakespeare, he was the most important figure in Stratford's history. He also built the impressive tower and nave of the Guild Chapel in Church Street, Clopton was a Stratford man who became Lord Mayor of London during the reign of Henry VII and retired here to give some of his wealth for the benefit of his hometown.
Yes, I think Stratford was blessed by being associated with a number of really very illustrious and men in pre-Shakespearean days and who achieved a lot of distinction. There was the Clopton family. Before them, there was the Stratford family, which we haven't mentioned, particularly John de Stratford, who was largely responsible for building the lovely parish church that we see now.
The predominant feature of Stratford's architectural style is the half-timbered pattern associated with the Tudor period, although many of the houses before 1600 were destroyed by fire, particularly the Great Fires of 1594 and 1596. Many of the houses would have had thatched roofs, like this one, but most have been replaced with tiles to reduce the risk of fire. But there are still some fine examples of early houses. These buildings would have been constructed of local materials, timber from the Forest of Arden and stone from nearby Wilmcote. It was here in Wilmcote, in this large half-timbered house, that Shakespeare's mother, Mary Arden, lived with her parents and 7 sisters. They were an old leading country family of yeomen who were independent, property-owning farmers. Their early 16th century house is one of striking size and proportions and has changed little since Shakespeare's day. The interior contains pieces of farm furniture, typical of the period. The original farmyard is enclosed by barns, a large dovecote, cowsheds and outbuildings which are preserved intact. Today they house a fascinating collection of old farming implements, capturing perfectly the atmosphere of the Tudor homestead. In 1557, Mary Arden was to marry John Shakespeare, who was already living in Henley Street in Stratford, where he was working as a glove maker and wool trader. The date the house was built is unknown, but the architectural features suggest late 15th or early 16th century. The building consists of oak beam frames, which sit on a low stone foundation wall. The spaces between the timbers are filled in with wattle and daub. It was in this house that William Shakespeare was born.
He was the eldest son, but in fact the 3rd child of 8 children who were born over some 20 years to John and Mary. So he would have grown up in a middle-class, prosperous family. His father, John, went on to become involved in the local council, eventually becoming its mayor in 1568. He would have been able to have been sent to the local grammar school.
The simple furnishings are typical of an Elizabethan middle-class house, although none of the furniture actually belonged to the Shakespeare family. The only piece connected with Shakespeare is this chair, which is alleged to have been his drinking chair from the Falcon Inn at Bidford. The kitchen has a wide-open hearth, where all the cooking would have been done, and ox, sheep or pigs would have been roasted on this huge spit over an open fire. A dangerous place for a child, but something which certainly hadn't been overlooked.
Well, this is an interesting, curious device for teaching a child to walk. The child was placed inside the metal collar, around its back, and then he or she would hold on to the arm, and they would then be able to walk round in a circle, literally, and this would keep them up. They would learn how to walk without falling down and keep them away from the perils of the fire.
Tradition has it that the birth took place here in this bedroom, which has been drawing visitors since the 17th century.
This is certainly where they've always maintained that the poet was born. And they also seem to have encouraged, willingly, visitors to autograph the walls and ceiling of the room itself. In fact, at one time, virtually all the House of Commons and House of Lords, the literary society of the day, scrawled their names on the walls and ceiling. Sadly, all that's left now is the window. The walls have been whitewashed over, but the window contains the signatures of Sir Walter Scott, Ellen Terry, Henry Irving, and Thomas Carlyle, for example.
This upstairs room adjoining the bedroom is where John would have prepared leather and made gloves. A ceiling would have obscured these roof timbers, providing storage space above for his wool and leather.
The majority of people living in Shakespeare's Stratford would be involved in occupations to do with clothing and with food and with agriculture generally. But it's certainly true there was a thriving gloving industry, and I think the glovers, including Shakespeare's father, were not only meeting local needs, but clearly were, if you like, exporting their gloves much further distances, probably even as far as London.
The young Shakespeare was educated here at King Edward VI's Grammar School in Church Street. It has been suggested that after leaving school, he might have even taught here. But little is known about this part of his life. At the age of 18, William Shakespeare started courting a young woman of 26 by the name of Anne Hathaway. She lived here in this cottage at Shottery, about a mile from Stratford.
Well, we know that Anne was born in this house. Her father was a prosperous farmer in the area during the mid-16th century. But of course, 400 years ago, you wouldn't find the documentation such as diaries, portraits, things like this. So of course, Anne's life is all rather sketchy. But we know that she grew up here to the age of 26. And when young William Shakespeare, who belonged to a prosperous family from the town, came to court her here, they sat on this old seat, which of course it was the Hathaways themselves who preserved this particular relic in the house as being where Shakespeare and Anne got to know each other better. It would be quite an experience sitting on it now, but presumably 400 years ago, when people generally were somewhat smaller perhaps than we are today and wore more layers of clothing, the odd splinter wouldn't matter. But many visitors who sit on it now find how uncomfortable it really is.
The rooms are typical of the period, and unlike Shakespeare's birthplace, much of the furniture here actually belonged to the Hathaway family, including this magnificent bed. But it was in Henley Street that William and Anne were to live.
They were married during Advent, during November 1582, and once they were married, as far as we can tell, as William was the eldest son in his family, he would have taken Anne from here, and they would have gone the 1.5 miles into Stratford to Henley Street, because being the eldest son, provision would have been made within that family for William to take up residence with his new wife. And that's, of course, where they continue to live. Susanna, their eldest daughter, was born there in March of the following year, 1583. The twins were born 2 years after that, and of course at the age of 24, Shakespeare left Stratford to commence his career in London.
Shakespeare is reputed to have left Stratford after a deer poaching exploit at Charlcote. Whether there's any truth in it, I suppose we'll never know. Between 1588 and 1591, we know nothing of his activities, and we don't hear of him again until 1592, when he's listed as an actor with the Lord Chamberlain's men. In the same year, we hear of the production of his first known play, Henry VI, Part 1.
That seems to be the beginning of Shakespeare's success, the Henry VI plays, particularly the third part, and the emergence of Gloucester, who becomes, of course, in the next play, in the quartet, Richard III, 1594 or so, and obviously the first great success as a play. The play in which Richard Burbage, Shakespeare's colleague, really throughout his career, the actor for whom most of the major Shakespearean roles were written, achieves his first success, as so many actors since have done with Richard III. A glorious vehicle for an actor. And I think, you know, that's where Shakespeare's greatness began, and in many ways the reason why it endures so well. Wonderful parts for actors.
Shakespeare's success in London was helped by people such as the Earl of Southampton, who acted as his patron, and other enthusiastic supporters of the theatre, such as the Earl of Leicester. Wealth accompanied success, and Shakespeare became a part owner of his acting company.
Shakespeare was a full sharer, or shareholder as we would call it, a man who had a portion of the box office for the performance of the plays that his company, in the early years, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, beyond the death of Queen Elizabeth, James I had the wit to see that this was an extremely good acting company and took it into his own patronage, so the company becomes the King's Men after 1603. Shakespeare was a full sharer in that company, sharing the profit, and no doubt occasionally the loss, made by the plays which they put on. An actor, a sharer, and a writer for that company through the great bulk of his career. Unlike most Elizabethan dramatists, therefore, he got quite rich at it. He came back here to Stratford and bought what was reported at the time to be the second largest house in town.
Built by Hugh Clopton, this drawing is all that remains of the original New Place. It was demolished in 1759 by a member of the clergy who had become tired of the increasing number of tourists who came to visit it. The site is now preserved as a memorial. Access to the gardens is through Nash's house, which belonged to Thomas Nash, who married Shakespeare's granddaughter. While William Shakespeare grew famous in London, his family continued to live in Stratford. In 1607, his eldest daughter, Susanna, married Dr. John Hall. They lived here at Hall's Croft, one of the finest houses in Old Town. It was the only Shakespearean garden to be enclosed by a wall on all sides, although its present layout is modern. A striking feature is this ancient mulberry tree. Shakespeare retired to Stratford in 1611, and only 5 years later, on April the 23rd, 1616, he died at the age of 52. He was buried in the chancel of the parish church of Stratford, Holy Trinity, where a monument was later erected in his memory. The 18th century was a prosperous time for Stratford, which can be seen in its architecture. Trinity College is one of the many elegant houses that were built at this time. Changing architectural taste can be seen in its public buildings, such as the Market Hall at the top of Bridge Street, which is now Barclays Bank, and the fine stone Town Hall in High Street. The growing importance of Shakespeare at this time is evident from his statue on the side of the building. And a few years later, David Garrick, after whom the Garrick Inn is named, held the first Shakespeare festival, the Garrick Jubilee.
Well, the Garrick Jubilee was a great landmark, I suppose, in being not only the first formal Shakespeare festival ever held in Stratford, and the precursor of all those celebrations that have followed, particularly on significant anniversaries of the poet's birth or death. It was also, in some respects, I believe, the very first arts festival of any kind. It came about in a rather fortuitous manner. David Garrick, the great 18th century actor who had made his reputation in Shakespeare, kind of Laurence Olivier of his day, if you like, was invited by the town council to open their new town hall. And this seems to have given him the cue to stage a 3-day celebration in honor of the bard. Garrick worshipped Shakespeare. He had a statue of him in his garden by the Thames, for example. People would all arrived at the town hall for breakfast and for chat. But there was horse racing, there were costume processions through the streets of the town. The leading composer of the day, Thomas Arne, composed an oratorio that was given its performance during the Jubilee. There were many other events, masked balls and the like, but the one thing that was missing desperately from the programme was in fact a performance of Shakespeare's plays. Somehow that got left out. However, although they had their problems, and it rained, I think, for about half the Jubilee, it did set a very important precedent. And I see certainly all the later Shakespearean anniversary celebrations as owing their origins to David Garrick's splendid junketings in 1769 in Stratford.
The birthplace continued to attract visitors, but the ground floor had become a public house, and in 1806, part of it became a butcher's shop. The building went into a state of decay, and eventually it was offered for sale.
A committee was formed in London, headed by the Prince Consort. Charles Dickens was involved, Lord Macaulay, Tennyson the poet, and a committee of local worthies in Stratford, through public subscription, managed to raise £3,000. And on the 16th of September in 1847, the two properties were purchased in the hope that the government of the day were to take it over, but this later proved to be impractical. So, in fact, the Stratford Committee became the Shakespeare Trust, and they have administrated the property since then, and a careful plan of restoration between the late 1850s and the early 1860s was carried out. And also, the building, to reduce the risk of fire, was detached from the street. Literally, the two houses on either side were taken down, and the house today closely resembles the earliest picture that we have of the birthplace, which was done in 1769. But it does have very fascinating history, and in the museum attached to the birthplace, in what was originally the shop, we have many pictures and books and documents which relate to the history of the family, the documentation that we have about the house and the family living here, and then upstairs, Shakespeare's background, his life, his work in London as an actor, his source material that he used for the plots of his plays, and also, above all, some of the foreign translations that we now have of him, because above all, apart from any other literary figure, he has perhaps been the most translated from French and Italian to Swahili and Bengali and so on. So we have quite an extensive collection of foreign translations in the library here.
But much greater monuments to the genius of Shakespeare stand today: the Royal Shakespeare Theatre and the Swan Theatre. The modern cult of Shakespeare owes much to the production of his plays by the Royal Shakespeare Company, and its theatres are just about as well known as Shakespeare himself. The Royal Shakespeare Theatre was designed by Elizabeth Scott and built in 1932. The design was rather controversial at the time and attracted a certain amount of opposition. The Swan Theatre was built in 1986 within the older building. It was designed by architect Michael Reardon, with an interior that's Elizabethan in concept. The Royal Shakespeare Company is constantly staging Shakespearean productions, and directors delight in finding new interpretations of themes which have changed little over the centuries. For actors, there's something special about performing here in the Bard's hometown. Despite a wealth of documentary evidence, there are some who still believe that Shakespeare's plays were written by Francis Bacon.
It's been suggested that the works of William Shakespeare were written by all sorts of people: Francis Bacon, the Earl of Oxford, and a number of other candidates. I think it's unbelievable that Ben Jonson, who writes a tributary poem to Shakespeare in the folio collection of his works in 1623, should refer to the sweet swan of Avon, Avon being, of course, Stratford's river, for any kind of nefarious or secret purpose. I mean, there's no point in foisting these works off on a 7 years dead middle-class man if they were really the work of a nobleman or somebody who already dead, who could have given them a more impressive parentage. There's no point in Ben Jonson endeavouring to perpetuate this secret. No, I don't believe it for a moment. Also, anybody who's read Bacon and read Shakespeare couldn't possibly think the same mind, unless it was a schizophrenic mind, had created both sets of writing.
In most people's minds, there's little doubt. And Stratford continues to draw millions of visitors every year who come to pay homage to Shakespeare's literary genius. Stratford has established itself as an international cultural centre, where studies can be undertaken at the Shakespeare Institute at Mason's Croft in Church Street, and at the Shakespeare Centre in Henley Street, from which the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust manages the properties associated with the Shakespeare family.
We offer courses of study for a tremendous range of students, from junior school children through to university students, teachers, professional university lecturers in Shakespeare, and also just ordinary people who are just interested in having perhaps a week in Stratford and who would like to get to know more about him. Here at the Shakespeare Centre, we also have one of the world's great resources for the study of Shakespeare. Our library has about 60,000 books in it, dealing with every aspect imaginable to do with Shakespeare and his times and his contemporaries, and the whole history of those plays in the theatre. We also have a marvellous collection of theatrical archives, in particular the production records of the Royal Shakespeare Company. These are looked after by us here and made available to students. And in fact, we have production records for nearly every play that's been performed at Stratford since 1879. You can imagine it's a very, very vast body and very rich collection, fascinating. Photographs of actors over 100 years, posters, playbills, the prompt books used by the directors and the stage managers, the critical commentary passed on the productions, and so on and so forth. And at this moment in time, we have a great many readers coming into our library, literally from all over the world, to use these resources.
Stratford owes its fame to William Shakespeare, and its long history, together with its strong literary associations, give it a unique place in English heritage.